All right, I hope this thing's on. Let's find out. Got just a couple viewers today. That's okay. We don't have a big class. We're just going to be doing kind of an exam review style thing. Let me know if the audio is working, as always. Those of you who are here. Hope you're staying safe. Hope the end of the semester is going well for you guys. I'll be kind of going over what's left to do in the class, which is, of course, you're just creating a short presentation and the last test. All good, Alex. Thank you. Good to know the audio is working. Yeah, so today, again, just a review. I'm going to kind of go week by week and give you a summary of everything we did in the hopes that, when you open up this final test, you nail it, because I want everyone to get an A. So let's get started about this final online test. So it opened this morning, 9 a.m. It's going to close Friday, basically at midnight. So you have the whole week to do it. It's going to be 15% of your final grade. And it's going to be more or less like the other quizzes that we've done online, just a little bit longer. So we're going to have 15 multiple choice questions on weeks 8 to 12. And then just 5 true or false questions on the remainder of the semester, on the first half, just as kind of a refresher of what we did. So it's cumulative in the one sense that we're going to be focusing on the new material, but we will also be looking back a little bit. And then there'll be one choice of one question, like a written response question. Write me a couple paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs, and I have a choice of questions. I think I have 4 different questions. Now this exam is open book, and in the sense that, I'm not going to be locking down the browser. You can absolutely consult the slides or any material you want as you answer the questions. Tam asks, will this PowerPoint be online? That's right, I haven't shared it. Yes, I will share it to FOL. I'll do that right after class. Thanks for reminding me I'm supposed to do that. I was creating these slides yesterday, working on Sunday. In fact, why don't I share them right now, just so everyone can see them. All right, give me one little minute. I'm going to just share these to you right now. I'm just going to walk over to my other computer, create a shareable link, and let's get over to the FOL module for the class. I'm just on my other computer here. There we go, week 13, upload, create a link. There we go. All right, sorry for the delay. That was a really good point. I have now shared the slides to FOL. And in fact, why don't I just do that again here? I'll copy the link and I'll put it right here in the comments. There we go. So that's kind of it. 15% of your final grade. You got the test structure here. Consult the slides as you work. Test is going to be open from Monday through Friday. Again, very big picture kind of test. I'm not going to be asking very finicky, detail-oriented questions. I'm going to be asking really big questions about, definitions, main concepts, and the slides, my review slides, are going to be really good hints towards what's going to actually be the exam content. And just as a reminder, right, so here are the course requirements. We have kind of 3 quiz tests, right? 2 are worth 10%. One is worth slightly more. Wait, did I say 20%? Oh my gosh. Final test 20%, not 15. You know, this quarantine is making it hard to do my job. Oh gosh. All right. 20%. Other assignments, right? So we should have done the media literacy assignment already, analyzing fake news, analyzing a case study, short essay. I graded them over the weekend. Really nice job, by the way, you guys. Enjoyed reading them. And finally, the presentation. It's 10, 20, 40, 50, 60, 80, 100%. Yeah, so that makes sense. And your presentations, I had a couple questions about the presentation. For the presentations, the idea is you take your case study, analyzing a case study assignment, not your essay, and you just kind of turn that into a short presentation. The idea is imagine you've been hired by Snopes or some fact checker, and your job was to create like a short presentation, you know, that you could put on YouTube and just kind of say you need to debunk this myth. So like somebody who's on Google finds your presentation, watches it, and then understands why this is misleading or false, right? So as if you are in charge of creating YouTube videos for debunking fake news. It's legal now. I don't partake, but happy 420. I love that it's legal now. I don't even have to worry about this. Before I begin the review, let me just point to you a couple of links in case people were, you know, obviously we're living in these, people keep using the word unprecedented, but that's because it is in modern history. You know, we haven't had a pandemic of this magnitude in 100 years. So I've had a lot of questions about misinformation in the coronavirus age. So here's some interesting links I've been finding. One is these kind of anti-quarantine protests that have been occurring in the United States, which is not something we've really seen much of in Canada. A few enterprising Redditors started doing basically what I recommended we should do earlier on, I think in week 2 or 3 of the semester, which is you start like digging up information on the websites that are hosting some of these things. Like you could do a who is search, which tells you registrar information, which is information about who's paying for the website, who's hosting the website, so on and so forth. And by doing like a little bit of sleuthing here, a little bit of research, it turns out that a lot of the websites that are promoting these anti-quarantine protests are not organically coming up from like angry citizens in Ohio or wherever. They're all coordinated campaigns paid for by kind of ad and PR agencies whose job it is to create fake grassroots campaigns. We call fake grassroots campaigns astroturfing because astroturf is fake grass. Let me just click on this astroturfing link. So a grassroots protest is something that where people just kind of spontaneously organize and decide, right, that they want to hold a protest against something they dislike. Astroturfing is the practice of masking the sponsors of a message or organization to make it appear as though it originates and is supported by grassroots participants. Right? So you give the statements credibility by withholding information about the source's financial connections or organizing connections. So instead of grassroots, it's astroturf. So some very nice research here, just by ordinary people, which is what I suggested we do in week 2, right? Suggests by looking at the information that's publicly available that all these campaigns are actually centrally coordinated, often by people like the NRA and other gun control organizations. So, you know, look at those. It's really quite fascinating. And this is, of course, a picture from the Ohio anti-quarantine protests. Another study here by Routers, who analyzed several hundred pieces of coronavirus misinformation online, said one of the common themes here is that most of the information is not fabricated entirely, but contains a little bit of true information, which is spun twisted, recontextualized, reworked to make it seem like something different. So again, when we think of fake news in the classic sense, we think of something that's entirely made up, completely fabricated. Um, but as fake news evolves, we find that it becomes increasingly sophisticated, where the idea is that we have a grain of truth and then we're just using it to mislead people, because the average person is now too smart to be taken in by complete fabrication, often. So we need something kind of misleading instead. So you can click through a very fascinating study by Routers about coronavirus misinformation. Um, for the actual deep dive conspiracy stuff, I have a Medium article here which talks about conspiracy theories. I don't know if anybody has heard these ones, that the coronavirus illness is not caused, in fact, by virus, but is caused by the 5G cell phone rollout, which is a weird conspiracy because, of course, there are places without 5G where people are getting sick. There is basically no way a radio wave could cause a respiratory illness. It's just a very bizarre conspiracy. I'm seeing it a lot on my research Facebook page, the Facebook page I use to kind of follow conspiracy theories. There's another one that Bill Gates is behind it. The coronavirus vaccine is actually going to be like a microchip program to start the satanic domination of the world. It's pretty wild. So if you're interested in the crazier side of the coronavirus misinformation, this article is the one to look at. So that's just some links on, because I had some students asking me about misinformation surrounding COVID-19. So there you go. Let's start with our exam review. How's everyone doing up there? Just looking at the comments, we're good. All right, let's keep going. So I put together some review slides. I looked at the exam, right, and I created the slides specifically to help you write the exam. So the review slides are definitely focused on the exam questions. So those of you who are here, awesome. And if you have any questions about the presentations or anything else in the class, ask me in the comments, or send me an email. Everything has to be in by this Friday, though, because I have my own internal grade deadline. Okay, so fake news, week 1. That was kind of our introductory week. And one of the things I've been talking a lot about in this class is the idea that fake news initially had kind of a more narrow meaning, right? So back in 2015, 2016, when everybody was talking about fake news, they really meant it in what I call the narrow sense, smaller sense. It really was about websites often with like misleading names, and they were in the business of publishing false stories, and they were doing this just to get clicks, to get shares, and therefore to get ad revenue, right? It was just about the money. Often the people involved in this didn't have politics of their own. Often the stories weren't even that political. They became increasingly political as it became clear that's what was driving traffic, but it was about the money. Right? This is the sort of thing outlined in one of their first week readings called Inside the Fake News Sausage Factory, where it's really clear we have these kind of often like Eastern European, teenagers, 20-year-olds. They're web savvy. They understand how the internet works. They could put together a website and make $10,000 a month from Google AdSense by putting fake news stories like Pope endorses Donald Trump, that kind of stuff. Since 2016, though, I mean, the internet in 4 years, 4 years of internet time feels like a century. But since then, disinformation, misinformation online has become so much more than this narrow sense, right? It's become government-sponsored disinformation campaigns, right? We have stuff coming out of Russia, stuff coming out of China. We have that case study I think we talked about in the radicalization weeks, where governments spread misinformation about minority groups in order to justify rounding them up, and they use social media to do this. So that's kind of terrifying to me. We also have like the circulation of conspiracy theory, right? nobody is into conspiracy theory because they're going to be making money off of it. They're into conspiracy theory for a number of psychological reasons, where, believing that coronavirus is part of some evil conspiracy, makes them feel like they're more in control of their lives, like they have access to secret information that other people don't have. Right, that's week 2. We also have, right, really hyper-partisan political websites, right, that they can get a lot of traffic because it's telling people what they want to hear, right? Whether on the left that, Donald Trump is evil, on the right you got these sites like Breitbart or InfoWars. And again, they might be in it for the money because there is money, but they're also in it for their ideological reasons, for their politics. So fake news is way more than the sausage factory. It's become several distinct vectors of online misinformation. And the digital economy has really accelerated this, right? Because now that everything's online, and everybody's able to have their own information funnel, you have a decline of trust in the mainstream, because you can have your own, right, tailored information. There's a loss of revenue in investigative journalism. We have a lack of local coverage. Lack of local coverage is actually a big one because it costs a lot of money to investigate local stories. So instead, you can have like a hall of mirrors of national stories where everybody's reporting on other people's reporting. It costs nothing to go on Twitter and see what people are saying. And then you don't actually talk about local issues. Everybody's angry about whatever the national issue is because you don't have local coverage anymore. And also there's kind of an increase in echo chambers here. So these are all issues arising from, right, everything being online now, accelerating trends that create misinformation. In week 2, we talked about conspiracy theory. Now, there's definitely an overlap between fake news and conspiracy theories online. Right? It's not always the case, but some fake news stories feed into conspiracy theory, and some are just their own thing, right? But often fake news stories can push people towards conspiracy theorizing because there's going to be an increasing discrepancy between mainstream stories that are carried by sites that we trust, like AP News or Reuters, right? Things on the top of the factual pyramid on the media bias chart that we looked at. And there's going to be an increasing discrepancy between mainstream and these kind of misleading stories. And that gap requires an explanation. All right, why is the news so different if I go on Fox or MSNBC? Well, if you believe one of them's right, then the other one is clearly engaged in covering up the truth and being biased and being partisan, right? There's a conspiracy to cover up the truth, right? And again, I've talked about this one right now. The conspiracy that 5G cell towers cause coronavirus is a great example of how far down the rabbit hole you can go and start believing crazy things. So you can read fake news articles here, and then you have to believe in this kind of much larger conspiracy to validate this belief. So this is a link to a website here. It's actually, let me just click through this link here because that's a really nice example of the intersection of conspiracy theory, government propaganda, online fake news. Right, so this article suggests the 5G conspiracy theory was driven by a coordinated effort. So 22,000 interactions on Twitter, found a large number of accounts displaying what he called inauthentic activity. The efforts bear hallmarks of a state-backed campaign. So the often, right, existing conspiracy theories are amplified by state actors to sow misinformation and destabilize countries. So, man, I miss the days where it was all about fake moon landings and aliens. Those were the conspiracies I liked. So how do you tell a conspiracy theory from, a regular news story which involves, because conspiracies sometimes exist, right? I mean, clearly somebody conspired to kill Kennedy. So what makes a conspiracy theory the bad kind of conspiracy theory? Well, generally these things are always sinister and malicious. Right? They're always trying to do something nefarious, something bad, and they're kind of all powerful. Right? So the idea that you can get a cell phone tower to create a global pandemic requires really powerful forces at work, right? Because all the engineers who design them have to be in on it. All the factories that are manufacturing these things have to be in on it. Everyone who's ever been trained in, like, if you went to university or college to work on these towers to understand how the frequency spectrum operates, all these people are either in on it or duped somehow. It makes no sense. All the governments are in on it. Like, you just can't. It's too big. Um, Often the conspiracy theory is really large scale too. It connects lots of dots in the sense that everything is part of a plot, and the plot is not a small plot. It's not like, you know, somebody's trying to control London, Ontario. They're trying to control the world. So the idea is that the plot is often global domination by elites and outsiders, right, trying to take over the world. Here's an example. So here's something that was shared on my research Facebook page that I use to track conspiracy theory for this class. And again, this was shared pretty unironically. COVID-19 actually is an acronym. It stands for Certificate of Vaccination Identification. And then AI, first letter of the alphabet, right? Artificial intelligence. So COVID-19 Certificate of Vaccination Identification by Artificial Intelligence. Let this sink in. Are we awake yet? Now look, if you think about this for 10 seconds, if there was an all-powerful global domination plot by, like, evil geniuses, they wouldn't name the disease the conspiracy. They would just, why would you put this code in? Like, why would you do this? So really, there's a lot of paranoia and cognitive bias here in the sense that, right, you're looking for these hidden symbols to confirm, right, this conspiracy theory, but that's really makes no sense. Also, conspiracy theories often, right, they explain any large-scale change in terms of a single unified theory, so things don't happen by accident. So a pandemic like the coronavirus, again, seems like this one of these random things that just happens in history, because history can be pretty random sometimes. But if you don't want to believe that, because you're looking for patterns and everything, your conspiracy theory, again, shows you that history is unfolding according to some predetermined ideal, which is just a hallmark of paranoia. And again, these are really, conspiracy theories often are very historically very old. They can go back hundreds of years. If you go back and you read on the history, for example, of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, again, we're talking about stuff that's hundreds of years old, but a lot of the same themes are still reappearing in 2020. Okay, let me see if I can pick up the pace a little bit, because I've been live for 23 minutes and we're only at week 3. In week 3, we talked about fake news in the 2016 election, right? So week 1, an introduction, what is fake news? Week 2, conspiracy theory. Week 3, I talked a little bit about the 2016 election. I also talked a little bit about media literacy that week. So I said, look, identifying fake news is not really just about fact-checking, although fact-checking is a really important part. A deeper analysis of fake news involves, like, really analyzing it and figuring out what the misleading fake news is trying to do. What audience is it targeting? Who is it trying to activate? Right? Some fake news I'm going to dismiss because I'm like, obviously that's dumb, but it might activate or engage another audience. Or something might get me, I go like, oh gosh, I need to share this, and then some other audience will be more skeptical, because different audiences have different biases. So you kind of if you understand the audience, if you understand who you are, you can understand how the fake news is propagating. So you'll really need to understand also the ideas being presented here. Because fake news often has these recurring larger themes, and each fake news article is an instance of that larger theme. So what idea is being presented? Is this part of the globalist elite narrative? Is it part of the anti-vaccination narrative? Right? What's the kind of big picture that they're trying to sell you here? You should also look into the host and the website, right? A few slides ago I said these anti-quarantine protests are not grassroots, protests are actually being centrally organized. How do we know? Well, we look into the host and the website, and we see that the information there shows they've all been registered at the same time by the same people, right, and who are not local. And we also should examine the use of fallacies. So these are all things we should do when we're analyzing fake news. We're doing so much more than just fact-checking. So the question is moving from media literacy to the main topic of week 3 was, did fake news affect the outcome of the 2016 election? The data here suggests that exposure was really concentrated. The most significant consumption of fake news occurred in a small segment of the population, typically an older social media user who identifies as very conservative. That was your typical profile of as a high fake news consumer. There's also a lot of evidence that there was foreign interference amplifying existing fake news and sometimes creating narratives. The Mueller report said, right, here's the evidence that the Russian Internet Research Agency created fake Facebook protest groups, right, to try and further divide the population. The Russian approach, in particular, targeted both left and right voters. They tried to get both sides of an issue really angry at each other, right, because you want to deepen polarization in a society in order to destabilize it. That was the view anyway. So while all this was happening, however, most analysis suggests that probably the impact on voters and voting preferences was low. A low impact is enough to push a really tight election, but did it make the difference? It's really hard to give a definitive yes or no answer here. The fact is, most people have already made up their minds, and really, there's the people on the fence about it are the people you can push. All right, moving on to week 4, the backfire effect. So actually, we talked about 2 things here, right? So in part 1 of the class, I kept talking about some kind of media literacy ideas, and then I talked about the backfire effect. So let's start with the media literacy stuff. I talked a little bit about the Overton Window, which was one of your short essay possible topics. It could be an exam question, who knows? I'm focusing on stuff that could be exam questions. The Overton Window is an idea from sociology. It's kind of the range of acceptable ideas relative to some group. So there's some things that we can discuss, and some things that we just kind of all agree we just don't even touch. So the Overton Window is the range of things in which there's acceptable discussion, right? My example always is something like, compare politics in Canada to the United States. In Canada, it's unthinkable to privatize universal health care. Right? That's just not something any political party will ever propose if they want to get elected. All right, so that's outside the Overton Window, privatizing healthcare. In the United States, it's the other way around. It's really, really difficult for a political party to say, you know what, we should nationalize the whole healthcare system. People are trying really hard to shift that Overton Window so that universal healthcare is part of the range of acceptable ideas, but they're not really getting a lot of traction there. So one goal of online disinformation can be to shift the Overton Window, to take marginal ideas and inject them into the mainstream. And the more people believe in a marginal idea like anti-vaccination conspiracy theories, right? You shift the Overton Window and all of a sudden it's acceptable to discuss the possibility that vaccines do something evil. So the Overton Window is kind of one way of thinking about how misinformation works. I also talked about the idea of a meme. A meme is not just an internet joke. It's originally an idea due to Richard Dawkins, who said, look, ideas are contagious. If I tell you an idea and you've been exposed to it, now that it's in your head, you could tell the idea to someone else, and they'll be exposed to the idea. Right? So a meme is an idea. It's a contagious idea. It will mutate as it spreads among a population, a bit like a virus. Hence, that's why we call it going viral. So often, fake news contains memes designed to be kind of shared. So what memes show up in specific pieces of misinformation that we find? Right? That's kind of one of the questions I wanted people to be asking themselves as they analyze it. Is there a meme of like, this article is about globalist elites, right? Which is a meme that shows up again and again in misleading political news. Um, Now, once you have a meme in your head, it can be really hard to get rid of. Right? The backfire effect is something that occurs when you try to correct a false belief, but the correction strengthens the false belief. So after a correction occurs, people actually double down and they believe in it even more. Now, the good news is that this effect is actually pretty rare, but it does occur if the correction is too short, if the topic is too polarizing, and if the individual is really too deeply invested in the issue on a personal level. That's when you can expect people to kind of double down and say, like, no, even in the face of a correction. The best way to correct misinformation, right, is, I mean, you ignore the people that are lost causes, is you correct misinformation with really detailed information. And it's not just about correcting the false belief, and it's about replacing the false belief. Something has to take its place. You can't leave a belief-shaped hole in somebody's mind. Oh boy, these slides are so thick. Okay, science denial, week 5. Science denial is a big piece of online misinformation. What is it? It's when the scientific consensus of experts is just rejected by some amount of the population. All right, classic examples, right? In the literature, they don't call it like anti-vaccination; they call it vaccine hesitancy. So if you're interested in this issue, all the literature, the scientific literature on anti-vaxxers is called vaccine hesitancy. Um, Climate denial, right, with the rejection of the view that right greenhouse gas emissions by human beings are just changing the climate, making the earth warmer. Creationism, right? All right. So these are again the mainstream view of scientists is that we are changing the climate, that creationism is false, evolution is true, and yet a large amount of the population kind of rejects right science here. Sometimes these campaigns are funded by industry. Sometimes, right, you get tobacco companies in the 1950s and 60s hiring scientists, running their own studies, and they knew the answer to the study when they started, right? They knew what they wanted, right? They wanted to dispute the link between smoking and cancer. And now that it's 2020 and there's been court cases and documents that have been leaked, we know for a fact that in the 60s and 70s these companies engaged in a coordinated effort to exaggerate doubt, to sow confusion about the science, to create the appearance of a debate with two sides. So whenever you kind of see these tactics coming out of industry, right, you should put on your skeptical hat and think like, are we trying to create a campaign of science denial? Now, these campaigns are always possible in a sense because science is never going to be 100% certain. Doubt is always possible. And if you want your doubt to be effective, a smart science denial campaign will link social identity to the denial. So the idea is here, right, is that if you are, for example, a conservative, you can't believe in climate change because those things are incompatible. If you are the certain kind of like granola leftist hippie, right, vaccines are part of big pharma, and you can't be a good leftist and vaccinate your children, right? So by linking your social identity to it, you make the science denial strongly linked to social identity, makes it very hard to separate out. How do you convince people then? That's tough. What you have to do is show in some sense that the social identity is compatible with the science. Right? What you need is to have a sincere Christian who accepts evolution, right? Like what is it, Dr. Collins that we talked about. If you watch the Merchants of Doubt documentary, where they talk a lot about the tobacco campaign and the climate change campaign, right? One of the last segments in the movie follows around a Republican congressperson who was convinced by the science and is right. All he spent is a lot of time trying to show that look, you can be a Republican and be concerned about the environment. These things, right? In fact, conservatism is supposed to conserve things. So he's making that case that Republicans need to care about the environment. So he's showing that the identity is compatible with the science, right? Likewise, I might if I'm a natural hippie, and I might want to say, well, vaccination is compatible with caring about natural products, right? So all these, you need to show the identity is compatible with the science. Again, I'm repeating myself. That's week 5, science denial. Week 6, post-truth politics. Here's another really kind of interesting analysis of online disinformation, especially, again, since 2015, 2016 or so. What is post-truth? It's the idea that there's a large-scale disregard for facts and expertise. Again, I think this is a thing that you definitely see in America right now. You got anti-quarantine protests. You have people who think that corona's not a big deal. It's just the flu, bro. That the numbers are fake. Social distancing doesn't need to happen. So there's really a casual disregard for expertise. A lot of this stuff is rooted in an appeal to emotion. You know, there's you also see often statements that cannot be taken literally. They're just meant to kind of evoke a feeling. We have beliefs that are strongly tied to personal identity. Narrative stories and framing that exist to serve kind of partisan political purposes. What do I mean by narrative frames? I mean, that all you can think of your political opponents as being really homogenous. That we're going to frame the political issues in terms of us versus them, right? SJWs versus whoever, or the fascist. You might want to frame your opponents as fascists, right? These kinds of frames that are not literally true. It's definitely not true that Donald Trump is a literal fascist. That's ridiculous. But the idea is that if you could frame them that way, right, you can use it for your own political purposes. And finally, right, we get a lot of information laundering through friendly media, which is kind of a reference to the idea that you can push conspiracy theories through friendly media. So the White House might use a proxy like Breitbart News to kind of push the Ukraine Hunter Biden conspiracy theory. So here's an example of like a post-truth statement, right, which is Donald Trump saying Obama founded ISIS, the terrorist group. He said this at a rally. Later on in an interview, a friendly interview said, look, I know what you meant when you were saying that. You didn't mean it literally. You meant that he created the vacuum. He lost the peace, right? By pulling out too early, for example, in Iraq, he created a vacuum in which groups like ISIS could flourish and take control. And Trump corrects him, no, I meant he's the founder of ISIS, I do. So how are you supposed to, can you take this literally? I'm not, right? This is just post-truth stuff. It evokes a feeling, as Trump says later in the transcript of this interview, right? The crowd likes it. And that's really what matters. In week 6, I also talked about the idea that kind of post-truth can be viewed as a form of what Baudrillard had called hyper-reality, where our ideas of how things are or how they should be become more important than how they really are. Right? We all live in a kind of a media-saturated hyper-reality. And in the long run, Rodin, in the article we were supposed to read for this week, says, look, post-truth is more than an issue that happens within countries. It's going to become a geopolitical problem between countries. All right? Because if you can't agree on reality and on what's happening, that's going to be creating the conditions for international conflict. Right? For example, here, right, we have soldiers with unmarked uniforms, like little green men here. Russian Federation denied these were Russian troops. Right? Obviously, cannot be taken literally. They're quite obviously Russian soldiers. But the disinformation campaign in a post-truth context allowed this kind of annexation of the Crimean Peninsula before anyone could react. So it's going to become an increasingly source, like a geopolitical problem. Because if Russian disinformation campaigns, Chinese disinformation campaigns, American disinformation campaigns start spilling over to other countries, are targeted towards other countries, how do you respond? Right? Can this really deteriorate international relations? I think the next 10 years are going to be really informative in how this is going to play out. Okay, week 7. In week 7, we talked about data privacy and the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So obviously, social media companies collect enormous amounts of data on their users, and they use this data to sell advertising space. 90% of Facebook revenue, ad buys. Why is Facebook making so much money through advertising? Because, well, they can give advertisers really fine-grained data on who's going to be looking at your advertisement. So if you're in an ad campaign, instead of just putting the billboard on the side of the highway where whoever's driving sees it, Facebook comes to you and says, like, look, you want to target like women aged 18 to 25 that are interested in jogging? We got that, right? We can really micro-target there. Cambridge Analytica took it a step further. They said, look, forget about their interests or their demographic information. We can create a psychological profile of individual users on the basis of their social media activity. So it's not just what groups they belong to, but what kind of personality they have. The idea then would be to create psychologically customized political advertising, right? So if somebody's more traditional, and you can give them advertising that appeals to emotions, that evoke patriotism, that evokes, heritage, things like that would really activate a traditional person. But if somebody is more open to new experiences, you'd give different sorts of political advertising targeted for their psychology. Right? Again, this is a huge change from traditional mass advertising. At best, you were focusing on like, we need men age 50 plus that are into baseball. All right, that's a demographic group. But now we're focusing on, right, find me all the neurotic people in the world and let's feed them with this advertising. Now, some people say that creating psychological profiles and then feeding customized advertising kind of didn't really work because the models, right, the psychological profiles weren't that strong, or you weren't able to create really customized advertising that could hook up to the psychological profile, right? So it didn't have the impact people said it did. So even if that's right, and I'm skeptical that that's right because I think what Cambridge Analytica was doing is very sophisticated. Um, but the question is, as these technologies mature, and they will, right, we'll have better models, more data, how will it impact democracy? Should there be restrictions on how private data can be used, right? Should there be regulation about what sorts of ad campaigns companies can run on the basis of our user data, right? Because maybe Cambridge Analytica in 2015, 2016 wasn't able to do everything it said it was going to be able to do, but how about 2020, 2024, right? 2030, what are these technologies going to look like 10 years from now as they become more sophisticated? Should we get ahead of it and nip it in the bud before democracy as a whole becomes a contest of algorithmic big data manipulation? That's kind of the worry here. Week 8, moving from Cambridge Analytica, we talked about another aspect of social media, which was online radicalization. So on social media, right, what gets widely shared? What goes viral? Some of the content that goes viral because it creates activating emotions. Right, so that gives kind of a boost to content. So if you have lots of activating emotions, more people share, so you're going to see lots more propagation. What's an activating emotion? It's an emotion that makes you want to do something, to act. Now, activating emotions could be positive. It could be awe, surprise, right? Like a lot of comedy is very activating because you want to share the surprising punchline. But also activating emotions can be pretty negative. It could be anger, outrage. Now, false or misleading stories go viral and are shared more because they can be designed to create these activating emotions because they don't have regard for the truth. You can kind of engineer them to make sure they activate an emotion. Now, the truth is complex. The truth is deactivating. So if you've been looking at your social media feeds, you might have seen positive activating emotion fake news, right? There's lots of them about, there's dolphins in the canals in Italy. Well, that's not true. But it generated like awe about nature, surprise, so it was mostly kind of positive. There's also been lots of like negative activating emotion stuff that's been circulating on social media. Um, so fake stories have a little bit of an edge over real stories, right? Because they can be designed to create activating emotions. This is definitely a problem, not just because more fake news gets shared, which is bad in and of itself, but also because at the limit, the worst case scenario is that these can be used, right, to radicalize individuals by exposing them to an addictive stream of constant, strong, activating political content. Right? People can get addicted to a cycle of anger and outrage, and eventually, right, it kind of radicalizes the individual into believing, right, that, right, because if the forces that are making you angry should be stopped. The So how did this happen? When Facebook was created, when Twitter was created, what you had was kind of a view that people called techno-utopianism. Um, the people that created social media, Mark Zuckerberg, 2005, 2006, when people were kind of had these early critiques, said, you got to be careful here because anybody could share anything, and they said, no, I believe connection is good. I think the free exchange of information is good. I think dismantling informational gatekeepers is good. Right? A gatekeeper is somebody who decides what gets published, right? So a newspaper is not going to run any story. A newspaper is going to have an editorial board. It might have, standards of practice. It's going to have journalists that are trained, so they're going to decide what to publish. But on social media, there are no gatekeepers. I can write literally anything I want and publish it, and then it could be shared or not shared. So there are no more gatekeepers. And the people that created social media thought this would just be good. If you're still listening here, I know there's a few listeners. There's an exam question about the techno-utopians. So jot that down. Exam question on this bullet point right here. Okay? 47 minutes deep into it, giving you exam questions. But of course, it's not obviously always good to dismantle a gatekeeper. And it's not always good that people should just share whatever they want. It's nice that they can do it, but it can also have bad consequences, and we should think about these consequences. Not because we should dismantle Facebook necessarily. It's not kind of an on-off switch. I'm just saying we need to think about what we're doing. Because in some cases, right, an addictive stream of outrage can lead to radicalization. Here's the definition of radicalization: increased preparation for and commitment to intergroup conflict. All right, so you believe that conflict is inevitable. Here's another exam question. Increased preparation and commitment to intergroup conflict. All right, so if you're, right, constantly outraged by just choose a group by the campus SJWs or whatever, you might eventually believe conflict is inevitable, right, with these delusional people. So there's going to be preparation for, right, in the slides for week 8 I talk about, right, for example, some people think conflict with Antifa is inevitable, conflict with Trump supporters is inevitable, right? This is what is just online radicalization. Because of course, if you go out in the real world, you're not going to bump into anyone you're actually going to want to fight, right? It's all online. So how does radicalization occur through social media? Right? How do you actually hook on to streams of addiction and activating emotions? Well, it can be deliberately created through government propaganda. You can be targeted by recruitment campaigns. So I've talked a little bit about alt-right recruitment campaigns because they were very self-conscious about what they would call giving the red pill to the normies, right? Getting them radicalized and into these alt-right groups. On the left, you also have, right, kind of virtue signaling campaigns where you have to show that, right, you're virtuous, and often it kind of leads to these one-up campaigns where, like, no, I'm more virtuous, no, I'm more virtuous, right, and eventually this kind of leads to cycles of radicalization. Data voids, which is the idea that where no good search results exist, you can kind of squat on it. If you get there first, right, you can kind of, you know, expose people to ideas that they haven't been exposed before, right? So presumably there's not a lot of scientific research on whether 5G cell towers do cause viruses, because no scientist would have ever thought that, because it's stupid. So if you Google, initially, if you went to Google and asked, does 5G cause coronavirus? The first few hits early on would have been all these people going, like, these YouTube videos going, why, yes, and Bill Gates doesn't want you to know. And finally, people can also manipulate algorithmic recommendations. And here the idea is that the algorithm doesn't really care what you watch, it just wants you to keep watching. But for people to keep watching, the content needs to kind of escalate a little bit, right? Because you get desensitized. So if you watch like a normal video, then the next video has got to be like slightly more out there for you to kind of click, right? So the language is going to become increasingly intense, the content is going to become increasingly intense, just to kind of keep you hooked in. And again, this is often automated. It's not deliberate, but people will create content knowing that, right, the algorithm is going to prioritize what gets more click-throughs, and what's going to get more click-throughs is incrementally more intense content. Okay, week 9. I'm going to try to keep this to an hour. It is 51 minutes. What did we talk about in week 9? We talked about Stanley's theory of propaganda. So obviously propaganda today is going to be more subtle than propaganda posters, right, before, because we've seen them, we're desensitized to them, we know to look out for them. Some tactics, some propaganda tactics include to pretending to be your political opponent online. Then you do a ridiculous thing to make them look bad, right? So, I mean, there's a link here, right? So I talked a little bit about outright propaganda already in the last slide. So, I mean, this is not created to make money. This is ideological manipulation, and you can kind of click through the link to see what kind of tactics we're looking at here. Okay. So, Stanley's theory of propaganda says that propaganda is often a intentionally manipulative campaign that undermines the very ideals that it uses, right? So, for example, right, the People's Republic of North Korea is not by the people. It's not a democratic. It's not a republic, right? So it uses language, but it doesn't actually support the language. Stanley, I have a slide here on biopower, but you know what? I'm going to skip this one. In fact, I'm going to delete it because, you know what? I don't. There's no exam questions on Foucault. I'm just going to go ahead and delete this slide. Okay, week 10. I talked about PR in democratic societies. This is we started going online here, and I can tell because things are a little sketchier. So we have democracy in large part because of an Enlightenment emphasis on human rationality. So the average person can be trusted with democracy because the average human is rational. In the 20th century, it critiques of these ideas that humans are rational. One was Freud's view. One critique of human rationality was Freud's view that humans are not rational because unconscious desires motivate our actions, not reason. Right, so we act unconsciously because of our subconscious. And the worry here, there was a potential for mob-like irrationality. And World War I kind of brought this to the fore. And we would have to carefully manage democracy to avoid the problems of irrationality. So Edward Bernays, who was Freud's nephew, read Freud and said, great, we can apply these insights to democracy. He says, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society, right? So we have to consciously manipulate the habits and opinions of the masses, and that's what PR is supposed to do. All right, propaganda, PR, public relations, a term he created, plays an important role in democratic society. All right. He says, ours must be a leadership democracy, administered by an intelligent minority who know how to regiment and guide the masses. Um, so the idea here for Bernays is that it's quite normal for propaganda to, how can I say this, manipulate and coordinate the opinions of people for democracy to occur. Right? We're free to avail themselves of tools required to create public acceptance for ideas. Um, and I think some of his examples were right when he had a campaign to get women to smoke cigarettes in the 1920s by associating it with the right to vote, with suffragism, with women's liberation. Um, so the idea here in this week was really just kind of put forward the idea that 20th century democracy has always been grappling with these, and um, what the advent of the internet has kind of done, in a sense, is right when Bernays says individuals and groups are free to avail themselves of these tools, is put these tools really in the hands of anybody with a laptop, um, which is really distinct from, of course, what would happen in a totalitarian situation. So in week 11, I talked a little bit about Arendt's theory of totalitarianism. I spent maybe too much time talking about what totalitarianism is, um, how is it distinct from communism and fascism, which can be totalitarian. But a totalitarian regime is any regime where the state basically doesn't recognize a limit on its power. Um, but central to totalitarianism, says Arendt, is the creation of a mass movement. The idea is that, right, individuals are recruited to serve in some grand higher purpose beyond themselves. This is the higher purpose is going to be presented as kind of the logical result of a picture of the world that is consistent, it's comprehensible, it's predictable. So a bit like, I think there's a sense in which every conspiracy theory feeds into a totalitarian mindset because it presents a world that is too consistent, that is too comprehensible, that is too predictable, because the conspiracy theory explains too much. Um, Much like a conspiracy theory, mass propaganda explains all events in terms of a certain ideology. Right? There are no coincidences. The leader's ideology explains everything. And the leader, the charismatic populist leader of the mass movement, speaks in the language of prophecy. Right? Can, as Arendt says, dissolve every statement of fact into a declaration of purpose. Right? Things are destined to happen because we have all the answers already. Um, these totalitarian leaders, right, is very distinct from how it occurs in a democracy, of course. But when you start seeing the shifts towards authoritarianism, towards totalitarianism, you start seeing these these charismatic populist leaders who derive their authenticity from the breaking of ordinary norms of discourse, as Hannah Arendt says. Everything that we used to pass over in silence is now spoken out loud, and we show the elite to be hypocritical and corrupt. And the leader is the only one who you can trust. In fact, the leader channels popular will better than democracy ever could. And once this mass movement actually is in power, you can use that power to shape reality. You can change history. You could erase the existence of people, as the Soviet Union did, just removing people from photographs, just removing them from the history books, to create fake science, to shape daily life according to the ideology. And totalitarian propaganda is often viewed as crude, but it's actually most successful when it's really polished, because you want ordinary people to slowly normalize their political situation. There's a famous quote about living under Nazi Germany where the person says, look, it was a series of gradual changes. There was never a great shock where people woke up and said, oh my God, I'm living in Nazi Germany, because things were normalized slowly over time. I should probably Google the quote, actually. It's actually worth, I should really just see if I can Google the quote live right now. Um, Here it is. Yeah, right here. Famous quote from they thought they were free. One doesn't see exactly where or how to move. Each act, each occasion is worse than the last, but only a little worse. You wait for the next of the next. You wait for the one great shocking occasion, thinking that others, when such a shock occurs, will join with you in resisting somehow. You don't want to act or talk alone. You don't want to go out of your way to make trouble, because you're not in the habit of doing it. It's not just fear that restrains you, it's genuine uncertainty. Uncertainty is a very important factor. Instead of decreasing as time goes on, it grows, because outside in the streets, everyone's happy. One hears no protest. You are an alarmist. You're saying that this must lead to this, you can't prove it. How do you know for sure that you don't know the end? How do you know the end? Anyway, it kind of goes on. It's a really this is the one I want to see here. The one great shocking occasion where tens or hundreds of thousands will join you never comes. That's the difficulty. If the last and worst act of the whole regime had come immediately after the first and smallest, thousands, yes millions, would have been sufficiently shocked. If, let us say, the gassing of the Jews in 1943 had come immediately after the German firm stickers on the windows of non-Jewish shops in 1933, right? There was 10 years in between instead. But of course, this isn't the way it happens. In between come all the hundreds of little steps, some of them imperceptible, each of them preparing you not to be shocked by the next step. Step C is not so much worse than step B. And if you did not make a stand at step B, why would you stop at step C, and so on to step D? Right. So this is really, to me, gets at the heart of how totalitarian propaganda really operates. Right. You want to really allow people to normalize their political situation as it occurs. And crucial to that is presenting a certain kind of polish to it, because things has to be presented as normal. Okay, week 12, media ethics. Let me just type a message here. It's just an exam review. A test review, I should say. It's not an exam. You can watch afterwards. Okay. So very quickly, week 12, last of the weeks here. Talked a little bit about media ethics to wrap things up. So the Trust Project says, how, when you're evaluating media, what should you look for? What are the trust indicators for reputable media sources? Well, we should see best practices. We should see expertise on the actual issues being reported, clear delineation of what type of work it is. So, I know what is editorial content versus straight reporting. There are citations, so you can see where the information comes from, transparency about methodology, actual local sources, right? Lots of diverse voices, and actionable feedback. These are all in week 12 slides, and since you're watching, there is one question in the exam where I'm asking you to link up each trust indicator to its definition. So that's in the week 12 slides. So you could just open that slide up and answer that question on the exam. I'm going to be linking trust indicator to its definition. So here's an exam question for you. As well, credible news sources will have public codes of ethics that they at least try to hold themselves to. So, for example, the one we talked about last week was the New York Times. They have a very large publicly accessible code of ethics and best practices and standards where they talk about how to avoid a conflict of interest, what you should report on and how, right? What counts as plagiarism, so on and so forth. So if they have these codes of ethics and they try to hold themselves accountable to it and they act on feedback, that's actually a good sign. I also talked about fact-checking, right? In the New Yorker, for example, has full-time fact-checkers. So again, reputable news sources will have fact-checkers on staff, or at least have a kind of a minimal commitment to accuracy, and they will issue corrections regularly because nobody's perfect. Journalistic ethics, right, on kind of the big picture. If you look at the Society for Professional Journalists, who they are, what they do, amongst other things, they train journalists in best ethical practices, they say journalists should do really two things, two big things. All right, you limit harm and you report the facts. Limit harm might mean you think about what you're actually reporting, right? Not every detail is worth publishing. And facts is, of course, you don't make things up, right? And one of the nice ways, one of the nice things about thinking about journalistic ethics, it allows us to kind of really identify fake news in terms of a failure of one or both, or one or the other or both, right? So some things online are false, but they're shared not necessarily without intent to deceive. So misinformation is when I say I share something that I think is true and I didn't realize I was sharing something false. This happens to the best of us. So sometimes online misinformation gets circulated by people who aren't trying to deceive on purpose, they're just misinformed, right? So it's not factual, but it's not intended to harm. Now, some stuff is shared, could be true, and is shared with intent to harm. An example might be doxing, right? So if I share somebody's name and address or place of work, that information can be true, but what's the intent? The intent is for them to, for example, be harassed for saying something I didn't like. So doxing is when you find somebody's personal information, you publish it online in order that they get harassed. So that's kind of malinformation, UNESCO says. And disinformation, finally, is our last category, right? It's both false and shared with intent to harm, right? Where we're hoping to share false things, specifically hoping to harm an individual, harm a society, right? By deepening, for example, political polarization, by corrupting a political process. So again, we can analyze fake news finally in terms of failures of ethics, a failure of the limit of harm and a failure of factual reporting. Now, yeah, there's an exam question here with the Trust Project. I think there's an exam question here, but I'm not 100% sure. But the good news is, don't worry. You can always look at the slides as you complete the exam. If you have questions about your presentation or your grade, or if I haven't graded something that you submitted, send me an email and I'll make sure to have a look at it. Things are, we're working from home, all of us are, so we're doing our best. I have a couple kids here, and things are pretty busy, but if there's anything I can do for you, do let me know. So that was what we covered over the whole semester. That was a lot of stuff. So again, thanks for hanging around for the review class. If there's anything I could do for you, send me an email. Otherwise, I'm going to end the stream because I teach again not so long from now. All right. Cheers.